Close your eyes for a moment and picture the Sahara Desert. You're probably seeing endless dunes of golden sand, shimmering heat waves distorting the horizon. Maybe a lone camel silhouetted against a merciless sun. The largest hot desert on Earth. 9 million square kilometers of parched earth, where the temperature can climb past 50 degrees Celsius, where rainfall might not come for years, where life clings to the margins in desperate, scattered pockets. A place so hostile that crossing it has been a death sentence for countless travelers throughout history. A monument to desolation. Now imagine something impossible. Imagine that same landscape covered in grass. Not sparse, struggling tufts, but vast, rolling savannas stretching to the horizon. Picture rivers, not seasonal trickles, but permanent, powerful waterways carving through the land, their banks thick with reeds and papyrus. Imagine lakes so enormous they dwarf anything on Earth today except the Caspian Sea. Lake surfaces, dotted with islands, shores teeming with hippopotamuses, wallowing in the shallows, crocodiles basking on muddy banks, elephants moving in herds across grasslands, giraffes browsing on acacia trees, antelope by the thousands, lions, leopards, rhinoceros, and people. Not the occasional Tuareg nomad moving between distant oases, but thriving communities. Settlements of hunter-gatherers feasting on 150-kilogram Nile perch, pulled from crystalline waters. Families gathered around cooking fires, children playing, dogs barking. Later, pastoral peoples herding cattle across green hills, their artists painting and carving images on rock walls that would survive for 10,000 years. A landscape alive with the sounds that we associate not with deserts, but with the heart of Africa, hundreds of kilometers south of where this abundance actually existed. Impossible. No. This was real. This was the Sahara. Not in some primordial epoch millions of years before humans walked the Earth, but recently, astonishingly recently. If you enjoy learning about ancient history, you would really be helping me out by liking the video and subscribing. Thank you. Now back to the video. While Stonehenge was being built in Britain, the Sahara was still green. When the first pharaohs were unifying Egypt, there were still lakes in what is now desert. When Abraham is said to have lived, according to biblical chronology, the transformation was still in living memory for the peoples who had been forced to abandon their ancestral lands. The Green Sahara. Scientists call it the African humid period. It lasted from approximately 11,000 years ago to around 5,000 years ago. 6,000 years of abundance in a place that is now synonymous with emptiness. And it wasn't a fluke, a one-time event. The Sahara has done this dance between desert and garden not once, but potentially as many as 230 times over the past 7 to 8 million years, greening and drying in a cycle as regular as clockwork, driven by forces so vast and slow that they operate on timescales that make empires look like mayflies. Tonight, we're going to tell you the story of the Green Sahara, how it came to be, what lived there, the people who called it home, the art they left behind, and how it all ended, sometimes gradually, sometimes with terrifying speed, transforming one of the most life-giving environments on Earth into the largest barrier on the African continent. We'll explore the science behind these transformations, cycles driven by the subtle wobble of our planet as it spins through space. We'll stand beside ancient peoples as they watch their world dry up around them, forcing migrations that would reshape civilizations and may have influenced the rise of ancient Egypt itself. This isn't just ancient history. The story of the Green Sahara is a window into how quickly and dramatically Earth's climate can shift. It's a reminder that the landscapes we think of as permanent, as fundamental features of our world, are actually temporary conditions in an ever-changing dance between ocean, atmosphere, orbit, and time. And it raises a haunting question as we face our own climate crisis. If the Sahara could transform from paradise to wasteland in mere centuries, what else might be possible in our rapidly warming world? So settle in, let the modern world fade away, and let's journey back to a time when the Sahara was green, when the rains came, and when the desert was a memory that nobody living could recall. The Sahara before, a world unrecognizable. To understand the Green Sahara, we first need to go back even further to see what came before. 20,000 years ago, during what scientists call the last glacial maximum, the Sahara was actually larger than it is today. Not greener, larger. While ice sheets, kilometers thick, covered much of North America and Europe, locking up so much water that sea levels dropped by over 100 meters, the Sahara expanded far beyond its current boundaries. The climate was brutal. Massive sand dunes, some reaching heights of 100 meters or more, march across the landscape. The Great Lakes that would later dominate the region, like Lake Chad, were either completely dry or reduced to tiny hypersaline puddles. Even rivers that flow today, like the White Nile, ran at trickle levels or stopped entirely. The Sahara was a barrier so complete that it effectively cut Africa in two, isolating the populations of the north from those of the sub-Saharan regions. Archaeological evidence from this period is scarce because, quite simply, there was almost nothing living there. The few humans who might have ventured into its margins left little trace. It was, in every sense, a dead zone. The global climate system was locked into Ice Age conditions. The West African monsoon, which today brings seasonal rains to the Sahel region just south of the Sahara, was weak and pushed far to the south. Without that moisture, the Sahara baked and died. But Earth's orbit was slowly changing, not rapidly enough for anyone to notice in a single lifetime, or even in 100 lifetimes, but inexorably, following patterns that would eventually flip the Sahara's fortunes entirely. Then, around 14,600 years ago, something shifted. The Ice Age was ending. The massive glaciers covering the northern continents began their long, grinding retreat. Sea levels started to rise, and critically, the monsoon rains began to creep northward. This wasn't like someone flipping a light switch. The transformation took time, and the evidence shows it happened in stages. By around 13,000 years ago, the earliest signs of greening appear in the geological record. Pollen cores from lake sediments show the arrival of grasses and shrubs. Dry valleys began to see seasonal water flow. Ancient dunes became stabilized by vegetation taking root in sand that had been barren for millennia. And then, over the next several thousand years, the transformation accelerated. By around 11,000 years ago, much of the Sahara was unrecognizable. Where dunes had stretched to the horizon, grasslands waved in the breeze. Where dry wadis had cut lifeless channels through stone, rivers now flowed year-round, fed by monsoon rains that fell with reliable abundance. The peak of the African humid period, as scientists call it, came between roughly 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. During these 3 millennia, the Sahara reached something close to its maximum wetness, a condition so different from today that early European explorers who heard descriptions of ancient rock art showing hippos and elephants in what was now pure desert thought the reports must be fantasies or hoaxes. Let's put some numbers to this transformation, because the scale is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Today, much of the Central Sahara receives less than 50 millimeters of rain per year. Some areas go years without any measurable precipitation at all. During the Green Sahara, rainfall in these same regions likely exceeded 500 to 800 millimeters annually, possibly more in some areas. That's roughly the same as what London or Seattle receives today. Not tropical rainforest levels, but more than enough to sustain rich grasslands, shrublands, scattered woodland, and permanent bodies of water. The vegetation zones shifted dramatically northward. Plants that today are found only in the Sahel region, the semi-arid transition zone south of the desert, grew as far north as southern Libya and Algeria. Even species from the Congo rainforest made appearances in pollen records from the Central Sahara. It wasn't that the entire Sahara became rainforest, but rather a complex mosaic of different habitats. Grasslands dominated the flatter areas. Wadis and river valleys supported gallery forests of acacia and tamarisk. Highlands like the Tibesti and Ahaga mountains, which today are barren rock, supported cedar and other montane species. And then there were the lakes. Oh, the lakes. This is where the story of the Green Sahara becomes almost mythical in scale. Lake Megachad. Even the name sounds like something invented by internet culture, but it's the scientific term for what existed in the Chad Basin during the African humid period. Today, Lake Chad is a shadow of its former self, a shallow body of water that has shrunk dramatically in recent decades due to climate change and irrigation demands. At its healthiest in the 20th century, it measured around 25,000 square kilometers. Large, but not remarkable by global standards. Lake Megachad, at its maximum extent around 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, covered somewhere around 400,000 square kilometers, give or take depending on which evidence you trust. 400,000. That's an area roughly comparable to Germany or the state of California. It wasn't just a lake, it was an inland sea. Imagine standing on its shores. The water stretches to the horizon in every direction. The far side is so distant that even on the clearest day, you cannot see it. The lake is deep too. Studies of its sediments and shorelines suggest depths that reached over 180 meters in places. That's deeper than many ocean continental shelves. This isn't a seasonal flood basin that dries up half the year. This is a permanent, massive body of fresh water, fed by rivers draining a catchment area covering millions of square kilometers. The lake was so large that it actually had an outlet. Unlike today's Lake Chad, which is endorheic, meaning it doesn't drain to the ocean and loses water only through evaporation, Lake Megachad overflowed through a channel that connected to the Benue River system, which ultimately flows into the Atlantic Ocean via the Niger River. An entire river system existed just to handle the overflow from this one lake. And Lake Megachad wasn't alone. It was simply the largest of multiple megalakes that existed across the Sahara during the humid period. In Libya, a lake called Megalake Fedzan covered vast areas of what is now the most desolate desert on earth. In Algeria, a series of lakes known as the Chotts Megalakes filled basins that are now salt flats. In East Africa, lakes like Lake Turkana and ancient iterations of lakes in Kenya expanded far beyond their current boundaries. All across North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea, satellite imagery and ground surveys have identified the remnants of ancient shorelines, beach ridges, sand spits, wave-cut terraces, all now sitting in the middle of absolute desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest permanent water. These aren't subtle features that require expert interpretation. Some of them are visible from space, clear as day, geological ghosts marking where water once lapped against ancient shores. The rivers were equally impressive. The Sahara today has seasonal wadis, dry channels that might see water for a few days or weeks after rare storms, only to return to dust and stone. During the Green Sahara, major river systems carved through the landscape. The Eastern Sahara in particular was crisscrossed by substantial rivers. Some of these connected the various lake systems. Others flowed independently, fed by rainfall on the highlands and by groundwater aquifers that were actually being recharged, rather than slowly depleting as they are today. Archaeological evidence shows that people lived along these rivers, settling in permanent or semi-permanent communities, rather than constantly moving as today's desert nomads must. They fished. They hunted along the riverbanks. In some cases, they may have begun experimenting with early forms of agriculture, or at least intensive management of wild plant resources. The biodiversity was staggering. Today, when we think of African megafauna, elephants, giraffes, lions, hippos, we picture the savannas of East or Southern Africa. During the Green Sahara, all of these animals and more lived in what is now Libya, Algeria, Niger, Mali, Chad. Fossil evidence and those detailed rock art images we'll discuss later paint a picture of an ecosystem as rich as the Serengeti. Elephants left their bones in cave deposits. Giraffe fossils turn up in areas that haven't seen rain in millennia. Hippopotamus remains are found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest modern water source. Crocodile teeth, fish bones, freshwater mollusks, all locked in sediments that are now baked by a relentless sun. The fossil record is unequivocal. This wasn't a marginal environment where a few hardy species scraped by. This was abundance. Even species that we don't typically associate with dry environments thrived. There's evidence of Nile perch, massive predatory fish that can grow to over 150 kilograms in Ancient Lake, Mega Chad, and other Saharan water bodies. These aren't fish that can survive in brackish or intermittent water. They need large, permanent freshwater environments. Their presence alone tells us that the lakes were substantial, stable, and productive. The climate itself was different in ways beyond just rainfall. Temperature patterns were moderated by the vast water bodies. The extreme temperature swings that characterize today's Sahara, where it might be 50 degrees Celsius at midday and near freezing at night, were dampened. The presence of vegetation meant the soil retained moisture and heat differently. The albedo, the amount of sunlight reflected back into space, was much lower with dark vegetation and water covering the surface compared to pale sand and rock. The whole system fed on itself in a positive feedback loop. More vegetation meant darker surfaces, which absorbed more heat, which strengthened the temperature gradient between land and sea, which intensified the monsoon, which brought more rain, which supported more vegetation. For thousands of years, this feedback loop kept the Green Sahara locked in its fertile state. But positive feedback loops are dangerous. They amplify changes. When conditions finally began to shift, when the orbital parameters that had favored the strong monsoon started to change, that same feedback mechanism would operate in reverse, turning garden into desert with a speed that would devastate everything and everyone who called the Green Sahara home. But that catastrophe was still thousands of years away. For now, in the period between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was alive, and into this Eden walked humanity, ready to make the Green Sahara their home. The science behind the green. When Earth's wobble changes the world. Before we dive into the human story, we need to understand why the Sahara greens and dries in these 20,000-year cycles. Because this isn't random, it's not chance. It's orbital mechanics playing out on a planetary scale, translated into climate through mechanisms so elegant they feel almost designed. The story begins not on Earth, but in space, with the relationship between our planet and the Sun. We tend to think of Earth's orbit as fixed and unchanging. We learn in school that Earth orbits the Sun in an ellipse, that our axis is tilted at about 23.5 degrees, and we file those facts away as permanent features of our cosmic home. But Earth is not alone in space. It's surrounded by other planets, all of them massive, all of them pulling on Earth with their gravity as they orbit the Sun in their own elliptical paths. Most significantly, Jupiter and Saturn, the two largest planets in our solar system, exert gravitational influences that, over thousands and tens of thousands of years, tug and pull on Earth, changing the parameters of its orbit in predictable, cyclical ways. These changes are named after Milutin Milankovic, a Serbian mathematician and astronomer who, in the 1920s, worked out the mathematics of how these orbital variations affect the amount and distribution of sunlight reaching Earth's surface. The Milankovic cycles, as they're now called, come in three main flavors, each operating on its own timescale. The first is eccentricity. This describes how elliptical Earth's orbit is. Orbits are never perfect circles. Earth's current orbit is slightly elliptical, meaning that in January, we're actually about 5 million kilometers closer to the Sun than we are in July. But the degree of ellipticity changes over time, varying from almost perfectly circular to somewhat more elliptical over cycles of roughly 100,000 years and also longer cycles of around 400,000 years. When the orbit is more circular, Earth receives roughly the same amount of solar energy all year round. When it's more elliptical, there's greater variation between the times when we're closest to the Sun, called perihelion, and farthest away, called aphelion. This affects seasonal contrasts. However, and this is important, eccentricity by itself doesn't change the total annual energy Earth receives from the Sun very much. It just affects how that energy is distributed throughout the year. The second parameter is obliquity, or axial tilt. Right now, Earth's axis is tilted at about 23.4 degrees relative to the plane of its orbit. But this tilt isn't constant. It varies between about 22.1 degrees and 24.5 degrees over a cycle of roughly 41,000 years. Axial tilt is what gives us seasons. When the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the Sun, it's summer in the north and winter in the south. 6 months later, when the southern hemisphere is tilted toward the Sun, the seasons flip. The greater the tilt, the more extreme the seasons. A tilt of 24.5 degrees gives you much hotter summers and much colder winters than a tilt of 22.1 degrees. At lower tilts, seasons become milder. At higher tilts, they become more extreme. The third and most important parameter for the Green Sahara is precession. This one's a bit harder to visualize, but stick with me because it's fascinating. Earth spins on its axis like a top, and like a spinning top that's starting to slow down, Earth's axis wobbles. The wobble is caused by the gravitational pull of the Sun and Moon acting on Earth's equatorial bulge. We're not a perfect sphere. We're slightly fatter at the equator than at the poles, and that bulge gets tugged on by external gravitational forces. The axis wobbles slowly, taking about 26,000 years to complete one full wobble cycle. But there's also a sidal precession, which is the precession of the elliptical orbit itself. The combined effect of these two types of precession creates a cycle of roughly 23,000 years. Here's why precession matters for climate. Precession changes which season occurs when Earth is closest to or farthest from the Sun. Right now, Earth reaches perihelion, its closest point to the Sun, in early January, during the Northern Hemisphere's winter. That means Northern Hemisphere winters are slightly warmer than they would be otherwise, and summers are slightly cooler, because we're at aphelion, farthest from the Sun, in July. But about 11,000 years ago, the situation was reversed. Earth was at perihelion during the Northern Hemisphere's summer. That meant northern summers received about 8% more solar radiation than they do today. 8% doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking about the energy-driving atmospheric circulation patterns and monsoons, 8% is enormous. This is the key to the Green Sahara. When Northern Hemisphere summers receive more intense sunlight due to the alignment of precession with perihelion, it creates a stronger temperature gradient between the land and the ocean. North Africa, particularly the Sahara region, heats up more intensely. Hot air rises, and as that hot air rises over land, it creates a low-pressure system that pulls in moist air from the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. This is the African monsoon. Today, it only penetrates as far north as about 15 degrees north latitude, roughly the southern Sahara and Sahel region. But when that summer insolation is cranked up by 8%, the monsoon strengthens and shifts northward, sometimes reaching as far as 25 or even 30 degrees north latitude. Suddenly, areas that today receive virtually no rain are getting monsoon precipitation. Not light drizzle, but heavy, sustained rainfall during the summer months. And because the land heats up so much and the temperature gradient is so strong, the monsoon doesn't just bring a little extra rain. It transforms the entire atmospheric circulation pattern over North Africa. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The insolation change from orbital parameters is just the trigger. It's what starts the process. But feedback mechanisms within Earth's climate system amplify that initial signal many times over. Remember those positive feedback loops we mentioned? As vegetation begins to grow in response to increased rainfall, the surface of the Sahara gets darker. Desert sand is highly reflective, bouncing much of the sun's energy back into space. But vegetation is darker and absorbs more heat. That absorbed heat warms the air even more, strengthening the low-pressure system, intensifying the monsoon. bringing even more rain, supporting even more vegetation. The cycle feeds on itself. Dust plays a role too. Today, the Sahara is Earth's largest source of atmospheric dust. Vast plumes of Saharan dust blow across the Atlantic Ocean, sometimes reaching all the way to the Caribbean and Amazon rainforest. This dust affects climate in multiple ways. It scatters sunlight, cooling the surface beneath it. It can seed clouds, affecting precipitation patterns. During the Green Sahara, when vegetation stabilized the soil and rainfall was abundant, dust emissions plummeted. With less dust in the atmosphere, more solar energy reached the surface, again amplifying the warmth and strengthening the monsoon. Water bodies provided another feedback. As lakes like Lake Megachad formed and expanded, they created their own local climate effects. Water evaporating from the lake surface added moisture to the atmosphere, making it easier for clouds to form and precipitation to occur. The lake moderated temperatures, creating more hospitable conditions around its shores. All of these feedbacks work together, amplifying the initial orbital signal. Climate models that account for these feedbacks can reproduce something resembling the Green Sahara. Models that rely only on the orbital changes without including vegetation, dust, and water feedbacks generally fail to produce enough rainfall to match the geological evidence. The implication is clear. The orbital changes were necessary to trigger the transformation, but the feedbacks were necessary to sustain it. And here's the truly remarkable part. This has been happening for millions of years. The Sahara hasn't been a permanent desert for all of Earth's history. Far from it. Based on evidence from ocean sediment cores, which preserve dust records and other climate indicators going back millions of years, scientists have identified evidence for over 230 separate greening events in the Sahara over the past 7 to 8 million years. Every roughly 20,000 years, like clockwork, the orbital parameters align just right. Precession brings maximum summer insolation to the northern hemisphere. The monsoon strengthens and shifts north. The feedbacks kick in, and the Sahara greens. Then, as the precession cycle continues, summer insolation weakens, the monsoon retreats, the feedbacks reverse, and the desert returns. This isn't speculation. Ocean cores show dust layers and non-dust layers alternating with remarkable regularity. Dust means desert. The absence of dust means vegetation covering the ground. The pattern is so clear and so regular that scientists use it to test and refine their understanding of orbital mechanics and climate feedbacks, going back millions of years. Some of these earlier Green Saharas may have been even wetter than the most recent one. There's evidence that during the Eemian period, the last major interglacial before the current one, which occurred about 130,000 years ago, the Sahara greening was particularly intense. Even more rain, even more vegetation, potentially even more extensive lakes. But here's an important caveat. These greening events don't happen during ice ages, even if the orbital parameters line up correctly. If Earth is locked in a glacial period with massive ice sheets covering the northern continents, the greening doesn't occur. The ice sheets cool the atmosphere enough to suppress the monsoon, overriding the orbital forcing. So there's an interaction between the orbital cycles and the ice age cycles. The result is that Green Sahara periods are more likely to occur during interglacials, when the ice sheets have retreated and the overall climate is warmer. This is why the most recent Green Sahara happened when it did. The Ice Age ended around 12,000 years ago, as the climate warmed and the ice sheets retreated, and as the orbital parameters moved into the right configuration, conditions became perfect for the African monsoon to surge northward. And surge it did. For 6,000 years the Sahara bloomed, long enough for entire cultures to rise and flourish, long enough for people to build lives, to think of the green landscape as permanent, as the natural state of the world. But precession doesn't stop. The wobble continues, slowly, imperceptibly. At first, summer insolation began to decline. The monsoon weakened. The feedbacks that had amplified the greening now began to operate in reverse. And the people of the Green Sahara, who had known nothing but abundance, were about to watch their world disappear. 10,000 years ago, if you could have stood on a hill overlooking the Sahara, the scene before you would have been indistinguishable from what you might see today in Kenya's Masai Mara or Tanzania's Serengeti. Grasslands rippling in the breeze, scattered acacia trees providing shade. In the distance, the glint of water where a river wound through the landscape. And dotting that landscape, moving in herds, grazing, drinking, living, would have been the great animals of Africa, elephants. Not the occasional individual wandering lost from some distant refuge, but herds of them. African elephants, massive and intelligent, their social structures complex, their memory legendary. They would have followed the same routes each year, migrating between wet and dry season ranges, just as elephants do today in the parts of Africa where they still survive in meaningful numbers. Their footprints would have pressed deep into mud along riverbanks. Their tusks would have scarred the bark of trees. Their dung would have fertilized the soil and spread seeds across the landscape. Imagine watching a herd of giraffes browsing on acacia trees in what is now southern Libya. The tall adults reaching leaves 15 feet off the ground, the younger ones testing their growing necks, their distinctive spotted patterns catching the light. Giraffes need a substantial amount of food, about 75 pounds of leaves per day for an adult. The fact that they lived in the Sahara tells us unequivocally that there was enough vegetation to support them, not just a few struggling individuals, but populations. Hippopotamus wallowing in Lake Megachad. Today, hippos are found in scattered populations across sub-Saharan Africa, always near permanent water because they need to submerge themselves regularly to keep cool and to protect their sensitive skin from the sun. They're also enormous eaters, consuming up to 88 pounds of grass per night. Hippo teeth and bones have been found in Saharan cave deposits and lake sediments, hundreds of kilometers from where any hippo could survive today. Their presence is another piece of evidence for permanent, substantial water bodies and lush grasslands extending across the region, crocodiles basking on mud flats. These are Nile crocodiles, the same species that still inhabits the Nile River and other African waterways. They're ambush predators, lurking just beneath the water's surface, waiting for animals that come to drink. Crocodile remains, teeth, scales, bones have been discovered throughout the Sahara, always in association with ancient watercourses or lake beds. Some of these finds are in the middle of what is now the most barren desert imaginable. Yet the crocodiles were there, the water was there. Rhinoceros. Several species of rhino once ranged across North Africa. Heavy, powerful animals that could be dangerous if provoked, but generally preferred to graze peacefully or wallow in mud. Finding rhino bones in the Sahara is another powerful indicator of the vegetation that once existed. These animals need substantial plant matter to survive, and predators, of course. Where there are herds of herbivores, there are predators to hunt them. Lions. The fossil record shows they were there. Leopards too, more solitary, hunting at night, storing their kills in trees. Hyenas, both spotted and striped species, scavenging and hunting in packs. Wild dogs, running down prey in coordinated hunts that required open terrain and abundant game. Antelope in astonishing variety, from small gazelles to large hartebeest and oryx, some species that are extinct today, others that have retreated to refugia far from where they once thrived. The rock art, which we'll discuss in detail shortly, depicts at least a dozen different species of antelope, each with distinctive horn shapes and body proportions carefully rendered by ancient artists who knew these animals intimately. Wild cattle, the aurochs, massive beasts that were the wild ancestors of today's domestic cattle. Bulls could weigh over 3,000 pounds, with horns that could span well over a meter. They appear frequently in rock art, suggesting they were common enough to be worth the considerable effort of hunting them. And birds. Oh, the birds. Water birds especially. Where there's water and vegetation, there are birds. Herons, ibises, flamingos on the lakes, ostriches on the grasslands, guinea fowl, francolins, countless species of waders and waterfowl. The skies would have been alive with them, their calls filling the air, their seasonal migrations connecting the Green Sahara to bird populations across Africa and beyond. Even the fish populations were remarkable. Nile, perch as we mentioned, reaching extraordinary sizes, but also tilapia, catfish, numerous species of minnows and cyprinids. These weren't marginal populations scraping by in isolated pools. These were thriving fish communities in lakes and rivers that supported not just the fish themselves, but the entire food web that depended on them, from the kingfishers and fish eagles to the crocodiles, and to the humans who would increasingly rely on these aquatic resources. The vegetation itself was diverse and productive. Grasses dominated the open areas. Dozens of species adapted to different soil types and moisture levels. Where Europeans would eventually see only sand and stone, there were once meadows where grass grew tall enough to hide a person, where wadis now lie bone dry and lifeless. Gallery forests of tamarisk, acacia, and fig trees created corridors of shade and shelter. In the highlands, different plant communities took hold. The Tibesti Mountains, the Ahaga, the Air Massif, these regions that today are among the most forbidding on Earth, supported montane vegetation. Juniper, cedar in some areas, wild olives. These trees need specific conditions, enough rainfall, cooler temperatures at altitude, and they got them during the Green Sahara. Pollen cores from high-altitude lakes preserve the record. The trees were there. Even plants we associate with more tropical environments made appearances in the pollen record. Seeds and pollen from species that today grow hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to the south. The implication is that during the peak of the African humid period, climate conditions in parts of the Sahara were similar to what we find today in the Sahel, or even further south. Not rainforest, not uniformly, but a complex patchwork of habitats ranging from dry grassland to woodland to riparian forest to wetland to open water. And into this Eden, humans came. The earliest evidence of human presence in the Green Sahara dates back to the beginning of the humid period. As the rains returned and the landscape began to green, people who had been confined to refugia along the Nile or in the Sahel began to expand northward, following the game, following the water, finding new territories that could support their communities. These weren't primitive people stumbling around with crude stone tools. By 10,000 years ago, humans had been behaviorally modern for tens of thousands of years. They had language, art, complex social structures, sophisticated toolkits, and deep knowledge of their environment. The people who moved into the Green Sahara brought all of that with them. The earliest inhabitants were hunter-gatherers, not hunter-gatherers as Hollywood might depict them, desperate and struggling, but people who had mastered the art of living off the land in its most productive state. The Green Sahara offered resources in abundance, and these people knew exactly how to exploit them. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of seasonal settlements, places where people would return year after year, building temporary shelters, creating work areas for processing food and making tools, burying their dead. Some of these sites are enormous, suggesting that groups came together in large numbers, possibly for seasonal gatherings, ceremonies, or simply because the resources at that location were so rich they could support many people. One of the most remarkable finds comes from a site called Gobero in Niger, located in what is now the Tenere Desert. Gobero was once on the shores of an ancient lake. Between about 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, it was occupied by a culture archaeologists call the Kiphians, named after another archaeological site where their remains were first identified. The Kiphians were tall. Skeletons recovered from Gobero show individuals sometimes reaching well over 6 feet in height. Some may have been as tall as 6 feet 8 inches or more. These were big people, physically impressive, and their size suggests good nutrition and health. They weren't scraping by. They were thriving. How were they thriving? Fishing. The archaeological evidence from Gobero shows that the Kiphians were serious fishermen. Harpoon points made from bone, fish hooks, net weights, the remains of enormous fish, including those massive Nile perch we keep mentioning. Analysis of the Kiphian skeletons shows isotopic signatures consistent with a diet heavily based on fish and aquatic resources. This makes sense when you consider the environment. The lake at Gobero and others like it would have been teeming with fish. A skilled fisher with appropriate equipment could have provided for their family with far less effort than hunting game or gathering plant foods. The fishing was good enough that people could afford to be relatively sedentary, staying in one place for extended periods rather than constantly moving. And it wasn't just utilitarian. The burials at Gobero are elaborate. People were laid to rest with care, sometimes with grave goods, positioned deliberately. One burial features a woman and 2 children, apparently all buried at the same time, suggesting they died together, perhaps from illness or accident. They're positioned so that the woman's hands rest on the children. It's a tableau of care that reaches across 8,000 years, a moment of grief crystallized in stone. The Kiphians disappeared from the archaeological record around 6000 BCE, during what appears to have been a brief arid period within the longer Green Sahara phase. The lake at Gobero dried up temporarily. When wetter conditions returned around 1,000 years later, A different culture appears at the site, the Tenerians, named after the Tenere Desert where they were studied. The Tenerians were different from the Kiphians, physically smaller on average, and while they still exploited aquatic resources, they show evidence of herding as well. Cattle bones appear in their settlements. Not wild aurochs necessarily, but cattle that show signs of being managed, possibly domesticated or at least semi-domesticated. This is significant. The Tenerians date to roughly 5000 to 2500 BCE, right around the time when pastoralism was emerging as a way of life across the Sahara. Instead of purely hunting wild game, people were beginning to manage herds of cattle, moving them between pastures, protecting them from predators, gradually selecting for traits that made the animals more docile and easier to manage. The transition from hunting to herding was one of the most important developments in human history anywhere it occurred. In the Sahara, it meant that people could potentially produce more food more reliably than by hunting alone. A herd of cattle was a walking resource, providing milk, meat when needed, hides for leather, dung for fuel, and building material. Managing a herd required different skills and different social organization than hunting, but the payoff was substantial. By around 4000 BCE, pastoral cultures were widespread across the Green Sahara. The archaeological and rock art evidence shows cattle herding from Morocco to Sudan, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of the Sahel. These weren't just a few individuals with a couple of cows. These were genuine pastoral societies with economies and cultures built around their herds. The cattle themselves were remarkable. They weren't the same as modern European or American cattle breeds. These were adapted to African conditions, with long horns that helped with heat regulation, and considerable variability in coat color and pattern as shown in the rock art. Some images show piebald cattle with patches of different colors. Others show reddish or dark coats. The diversity suggests that people were actively managing their herds and possibly selecting for specific traits. Living as pastoralists in the Green Sahara would have required detailed environmental knowledge. You needed to know where the pastures were best in each season. You needed to know where water could be found. You needed to understand cattle health and behavior. You needed to be able to read the landscape, to predict where rain would fall, to avoid areas where predators were concentrated, and the landscape itself was vast. The Green Sahara, at its extent, covered an area larger than the continental United States. A pastoral family or band could move extensively, potentially traveling hundreds of kilometers in a seasonal round, accessing different resources as they became available, avoiding areas that were overgrazed or depleted. But they weren't alone. This is key. The Green Sahara supported not isolated bands wandering a largely empty landscape, but multiple communities, possibly thousands of people across the region at any given time. We know this because of the rock art, because of the number and distribution of archaeological sites, and because of the genetic evidence showing that populations were large enough to maintain genetic diversity. These communities would have encountered each other, sometimes peacefully, trading, exchanging information, intermarrying, sometimes in conflict, competing for prime grazing lands or water sources. The rock art includes some images that appear to show conflict, armed figures in confrontational poses, though these are less common than more peaceful scenes. Social complexity varied. Some groups were likely more egalitarian, with decisions made communally. Others may have had emerging hierarchies, leaders, or prominent families. The evidence isn't always clear, because so much of what would indicate social structure is perishable. The temporary shelters, the social dynamics, the oral traditions and stories that would have been central to these cultures, but which left no archaeological trace. What is clear is that these people were deeply connected to their environment. They understood it in ways we can barely imagine today. They knew every plant, every animal, every quirk of weather and season. They had to. Their lives depended on it. And they left us a record. A detailed, beautiful, haunting record of what they saw, what they valued, what mattered to them. They left us their art. And it's through that art, preserved on rock walls across the Sahara, that we can truly begin to see the world they inhabited, the art they left behind, voices from stone. Imagine you're a German explorer in the 1850s, crossing the Sahara by camel caravan. Your name is Heinrich Barth, and you're one of the first Europeans to truly explore the interior of North Africa. The journey is brutal. The heat is relentless. Water is scarce. The landscape is unforgiving. Nothing but sand and stone as far as the eye can see. And then, in 1850, as you traverse the Messac Plateau, in what is now Libya, you notice something on the walls. Engravings, not recent graffiti or simple markings, but images of animals, elephants, lions, antelopes, rendered with care and skill. You're looking at creatures where no such animals could possibly survive today. Evidence that this barren landscape was once something entirely different. You document what you see with careful notes and sketches, but it would be many decades before anyone truly understood what these images represented. This was one of the first European encounters with Saharan rock art, though of course local peoples had known about it for generations. The real transformation in understanding came in the 20th century. Leo Frobenius explored extensively in the 1930s and early 1940s. Then, in 1956, French ethnologist Henri Lot launched a major expedition to Tassili Naja, the massive plateau in southeastern Algeria. He spent over a year there with a team that included artists and photographers. They documented thousands upon thousands of individual pieces of rock art, 15,000 at Tassili Naja alone. And that's just one site. Across the Sahara, from Morocco to Sudan, from Libya to Mali, rock art appears in caves, on cliff faces, on isolated rock outcrops, hidden in canyons, and perched on mountainsides. This is one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric art anywhere on Earth, and it spans an enormous time range, from possibly as far back as 12,000 years ago to as recently as a few hundred years ago in some areas. The art provides a visual timeline, showing us not just what animals and people looked like, but how lifestyles changed, how the environment transformed, and how human cultures adapted as the Sahara dried. Archaeologists divide Saharan rock art into several major periods based on style, technique, subject matter, and, where possible, dating. The divisions aren't always clear-cut. Styles overlapped. Different regions developed their own traditions, but the general progression tells a story that aligns remarkably well with what we know from other evidence about the Green Sahara and its eventual demise. The earliest period is sometimes called the Buberline period, or the large wild fauna period, with estimates placing it roughly between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago, though dating rock art precisely is notoriously difficult. This period is characterized by engravings more than paintings. The images show large wild animals, the megafauna of the Green Sahara, bubulus, an extinct large buffalo, elephants, rhinoceros, giraffes, aurochs, large antelope. The animals are usually depicted with great attention to detail. You can see musculature. You can identify species by the shape of horns or the proportions of the body. The artist knew these animals intimately. They had observed them closely, hunted them, lived alongside them. Human figures from this period are less common than animal figures, but when they appear, they're often shown hunting. Armed with spears, bows, or throwing sticks. Sometimes the hunt scenes are quite elaborate, showing multiple hunters working together to bring down a large animal. The implication is that hunting was central to life, which makes sense for this early period before herding became dominant. The technique involved carefully pecking or abrading the rock surface to remove the dark desert varnish, the coating of minerals that forms on rock surfaces exposed to the elements in arid environments. The removed areas appear lighter, creating contrast. Some engravings were then enhanced by painting or by deeper carving. The labor involved was substantial. Creating a large, detailed engraving might have taken days or even weeks of work. The next major period is called the Roundhead period, with estimates placing it roughly between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, though these dates remain debated. This period is distinctive for its painted human figures with round, featureless heads, hence the name. These paintings are concentrated primarily in Tassili Najjar, though examples are found elsewhere. Roundhead paintings often show humans in dynamic poses, dancing, reaching upward, running, sometimes wearing what appear to be masks or ceremonial costumes. Some figures are enormous, up to 13 feet tall on the rock face, towering over the viewer. The scale alone suggests these were important images, possibly with a ritual or spiritual significance. Animals appear in Roundhead art, but they're less prominent than the human figures. Barbary sheep, antelope, some cattle. The shift towards showing people rather than just animals may reflect changing priorities or cosmology, or it may simply be that we're seeing different aspects of life being represented, moments that were considered worthy of being preserved in art. The paintings use pigments made from crushed minerals mixed with binders. Ochres provide reds and yellows. Manganese or charcoal provide black. White from kaolin or gypsum. The artists achieved a remarkable range of colors and shades, and in many cases, the pigments have survived in remarkably good condition, protected from the elements by overhangs and the dry climate. But the most extensive and best-known period of Saharan rock art is the pastoral period, generally placed somewhere between 7,500 and 4,000 years ago, though precise dating varies. This period overlaps with the peak and decline of the Green Sahara, and the art from this era provides our most detailed visual record of life during that time. Pastoral period art is dominated by images of cattle. Hundreds upon hundreds of cattle, depicted in every conceivable situation. Being herded, being milked, standing in groups. Individual portraits showing specific horn shapes and coat patterns. The cattle are clearly domestic or semi-domestic, with markings and proportions that distinguish them from wild aurochs. And they're always associated with people, emphasizing the central relationship between humans and their herds. The human figures in pastoral period art are shown in a variety of activities. Herders with staffs, guiding cattle, women and children at camp, people dancing, sometimes in elaborate costumes with what might be ceremonial regalia, figures that could be shamans or ritual specialists, sometimes associated with unusual symbols or creatures. One of the most famous examples of pastoral period art is the crying cows engraving in southern Algeria. It shows a group of cattle with what appear to be tears running from their eyes. The interpretation is debated. Are these stylized markings indicating a specific breed or pattern? Are they actually representing tears? Perhaps a cultural memory of cattle suffering during drought? Or is it simply artistic expression with no specific literal meaning? We can't know for certain, but the image is powerful and has become iconic. The level of detail in pastoral period art is extraordinary. In some images, you can count the individual hairs of an animal's coat, see the muscles of its legs, identify whether it's male or female. The artists weren't just making schematic representations, they were creating portraits, capturing the specific characteristics of individual animals. Human clothing and adornment are also shown in increasing detail in this period. Elaborate hairstyles, jewelry, decorated belts and clothing, body painting or scarification. The implication is that people had time and resources for personal adornment, another indicator that life was relatively prosperous. Scenes of daily life become more common. Camp scenes showing tents or shelters, often circular structures that may represent the predecessors of the tents still used by some pastoral peoples today. Storage vessels, possibly for milk or water. Tools and weapons. The paintings give us a window into the material culture that has otherwise vanished. And then, as the Sahara began to dry, the art changes again. Around 3,000 years ago, or perhaps a bit earlier, images of horses begin to appear. This is the horse period. Horses were introduced to North Africa from the east, likely from Egypt or the Levant, and they were adopted enthusiastically by some Saharan peoples. The rock art shows horses being ridden and pulling chariots. These weren't the heavy war chariots of ancient Egypt, but light, fast vehicles suited to desert travel. The appearance of horses marks a technological and cultural shift. Horses allowed for faster travel across the increasingly arid landscape. They were prestigious animals, often associated with warriors or leaders. Some horse period art shows elaborate battle scenes, suggesting that competition for diminishing resources may have intensified as the desert expanded. Finally, there's the camel period, dating from around 3,000 years ago to relatively recent times. Camels, better adapted to true desert conditions than horses, became the dominant beast of burden in the Sahara. By the time camels appear in the rock art, the Green Sahara was long gone. The images show people adapted to desert life, moving between oases, engaging in trade across what had become a barrier rather than a home. But it's the earlier art, the Boubeline, round head, and especially pastoral periods, that gives us our window into the Green Sahara. And what a window it is, because these aren't abstract images or symbolic representations. They're observational. They're showing us what the artist saw, what they lived with, what mattered to them. Consider what it would have taken to create some of these artworks. First, you need pigments. That means knowing where to find the right minerals, how to process them, what binders work best. You need tools, pestles and mortars for grinding pigments, brushes or applicators of some kind, containers to mix and hold the paints. Then, you need to reach the painting surface. Some are at ground level or on easily accessible rock faces, but many are high on cliff walls or in difficult to reach shelters. That requires scaffolding or ladders, ropes, a team of people working together. You need light to see what you're painting, which in deep caves means torches or lamps, which means fuel, and you need time. A large, detail-painted scene might represent dozens or even hundreds of hours of work. That's time not spent hunting or herding or gathering food. For people to create art on this scale, they needed a level of economic security that allowed them to invest substantial effort in non-utilitarian activities. Why did they do it? We can't know their motivations with certainty, but art is universal to human cultures, and it serves multiple purposes. Some rock art may have been purely decorative or aesthetic, people creating beauty because they could and wanted to. Some may have been educational, teaching children about animals or hunting techniques. Some was almost certainly ritual or spiritual, marking places of power or ceremony, invoking forces beyond human understanding. Some researchers have noted similarities between Saharan rock art and the traditions of modern sub-Saharan African cultures. The use of masks in ceremonies, the emphasis on cattle in pastoral societies, the artistic styles and symbols. These connections suggest cultural continuity, the possibility that some Saharan peoples migrated south as the desert expanded, bringing their artistic traditions with them into regions where those traditions still survive today. And the art itself has survived, protected by the dry climate, by overhangs that shield the images from direct rain and sandblasting, and by sheer chance. But it's endangered. Some sites have been damaged by erosion, by floods during rare storms, by looters and vandals. Organizations like the Trust for African Rock Art are working to document sites, raise awareness, and preserve this irreplaceable heritage. Because when you look at these images, you're not looking at abstract prehistory. You're looking at someone's grandmother painting a memory of the cattle she grew up with. You're looking at a hunter's careful observation of the elephant herd that passed through his territory each year. You're looking at a child's handprint placed on the wall by blowing pigment over their splayed fingers, a gesture that says, "I was here, I existed." These people lived full lives with families and friendships, hopes and fears, stories and songs. They probably laughed at jokes we'd never understand. They cried at losses we can barely imagine. They felt the same fundamental emotions we feel, even though their world was utterly different from ours. And then their world ended, not all at once, not in a single catastrophe, but inexorably, gradually at first, and then with terrible speed. The Green Sahara dried, the monsoons failed, the lakes shrank, the rivers stopped flowing, the grass withered, the animals left or died, and the people who had known nothing but abundance were forced to make impossible choices: stay and die, or leave everything, walk away from the land of their ancestors, and seek refuge in whatever wet places remained. The exodus had begun. Imagine you're a young person living near the shores of Lake Megachad around 5,500 years ago. You've grown up hearing stories from your grandparents about how the lake was even larger when they were young, how the fishing was even better, how the rains came even more reliably. But to you, this is still paradise. The lake stretches to the horizon. Your people have herded cattle along its shores for generations. Life is good, but you've noticed things. small things at first. The rains in some years aren't as strong as they used to be. The dry season seems to last a bit longer. Your grandfather points to shoreline markers, rocks or trees that used to sit at the water's edge, and notes that now they're several paces back from the lake. The elders talk about it in worried tones sometimes late at night around the fires. But the lake is so vast. Surely this is just normal variation. The rains will come back. They always have before. Except this time, they don't. Not fully. Each decade on average, the monsoon rains are a little weaker, reach a little less far north. Each decade, the lake level drops a little more. Rivers that once flowed year-round now run only in the wet season, then as seasonal trickles, then not at all. Springs that provided water for your cattle dry up. Pastures that stayed green most of the year now turn brown earlier and earlier. This is how the Green Sahara died, not in a single apocalyptic event, but in a slow, relentless drying that played out over centuries and millennia. But here's the thing, for much of that time, it wasn't evenly distributed, and in some regions, when the end came, it came with shocking speed. The fundamental driver was the same orbital precession that had created the Green Sahara in the first place. As Earth's axis continued its slow wobble, Northern Hemisphere summer insolation gradually decreased. Less energy from the sun hitting North Africa in summer meant a weaker heating, weaker temperature gradients between land and sea, and a weaker African monsoon. The monsoon began to retreat southward. Areas at the northern edge of its reach were first to feel the effects. Based on the evidence we have, some of the northernmost Saharan regions were already seeing reduced rainfall by around 8,200 years ago. But the central and southern Sahara remained relatively wet. Lake Megachad was still enormous. The pastoral cultures were still thriving. The decline wasn't uniform or linear. There were fluctuations, periods of several decades or even a century or two, where rainfall increased again before declining once more. Climate doesn't move in a straight line. It varies naturally on multiple timescales. But the overall trend was clear. Less rain, drier conditions. The feedback loops that had amplified the greening now operated in reverse, amplifying the drying. As vegetation died back, the surface of the Sahara became lighter, more reflective. More solar energy bounced back into space instead of being absorbed. That cooled the surface, weakened the temperature gradient, further weakened the monsoon. Less rain meant less vegetation, which meant more exposed soil. Wind picked up the exposed soil as dust, sending vast plumes into the atmosphere. The dust scattered sunlight, cooled the surface even more, created its own feedback loop of increasing aridity. Water bodies began to shrink. Small lakes disappeared first, some in a matter of decades, as their inflow streams dried up and evaporation claimed what remained. Larger lakes, like Lake Megachad, persisted longer, but even they were shrinking. Shorelines that had been stable for thousands of years began to retreat. Islands that had been surrounded by deep water became peninsulas, then hills on an emerging landscape. For the people living through this transition, the changes would have been noticeable within a single lifetime in some cases, but not immediately catastrophic. If your family had lived by a large lake, you might simply move your settlement to follow the retreating shoreline. If pastures dried up in one area, you moved your herds to where grass still grew. Human societies are adaptable. They adjust to changing conditions, but there are limits to adaptation. And as the drying continued, those limits began to be tested. Archaeological evidence suggests that different regions of the Sahara dried out at different times. The northern Sahara, especially the northwestern regions near the Atlas Mountains and the Mediterranean coast, began to experience severe aridification somewhere around 6,700 years ago. There's evidence suggesting a particularly intense dry period between roughly 6,700 and 5,500 years ago in some northern areas. But the southern and eastern Sahara, regions closer to the modern Sahel, remained relatively wet for longer. The monsoon was retreating, but slowly enough that populations could adjust, moving southward gradually, tracking the habitable zone as it shifted. Then, around 5,500 years ago, something changed. Multiple lines of evidence suggest that in some regions, the transition from Green Sahara to desert happened extremely rapidly. Not over thousands of years, but over mere centuries or even decades in some locations. Marine sediment cores from off the coast of West Africa show a dramatic spike in dust deposition starting around 5,500 years ago. Dust that could only have come from the Sahara, suddenly increasing by orders of magnitude. Lake sediment cores from sites like Lake Yoa in Chad show abrupt changes in sediment type and pollen, indicating a rapid shift from wet to dry conditions. One study of the Lake Megachad basin suggested that the transformation from a giant lake to desert dunes may have happened in just a few hundred years in some areas. A few hundred years, that's 10 to 15 human generations. Long enough that your great-grandchildren would remember your stories of when there was water, but not so long that it becomes myth. Living memory stretched across the catastrophe. What caused this acceleration? This is one of the most debated questions in African paleoclimate research. The orbital forcing, the changes in summer insolation, were gradual. Why would the environmental response be abrupt? The answer lies in tipping points and feedback mechanisms. Climate systems don't always respond linearly to forcing. Sometimes they have thresholds. When conditions cross a certain threshold, the system can flip rapidly from one stable state to another. For the Green Sahara, that threshold likely involved the feedback between vegetation and rainfall. As long as enough vegetation covered the ground, the monsoon remained strong enough to sustain that vegetation. The system was in a stable state. But as rainfall declined due to orbital forcing, vegetation gradually died back. At some point, enough vegetation was lost that the feedback flipped. The surface became too bright. Too much solar energy was reflected. The monsoon weakened dramatically. With the monsoon weakened, vegetation collapsed. The collapse of vegetation further weakened the monsoon. The system cascaded rapidly into a new stable state. Desert. This kind of non-linear response has been replicated in climate models. When researchers simulate the Green Sahara using climate models that include vegetation feedbacks, they can reproduce both the greening and the relatively abrupt drying. Without vegetation feedbacks, the models show only gradual changes. With vegetation feedbacks, they show tipping point behavior. There's also evidence that different mechanisms may have been at work in different regions of the Sahara. In the northwestern Sahara, relatively close to the Mediterranean, some research suggests that winter rainfall from Mediterranean storm systems may have been important during the Green Sahara. When those storm systems shifted with changing atmospheric circulation patterns, the northwestern Sahara lost that rainfall source relatively quickly. In the central and southern Sahara, the African monsoon was the primary moisture source. The retreat of the monsoon southward was the main driver of aridification, but the pace of that retreat may have varied. In some areas, it was gradual, allowing populations to slowly migrate southward. In others, it may have been more abrupt, forcing rapid abandonment. And then there's the human factor. This is controversial and still being actively researched, but there's a hypothesis that humans may have played some role in accelerating the desertification of the Sahara through their pastoral activities. The argument goes like this. As the Sahara began to dry, pastoral peoples concentrated their herds in the areas that remained productive. But cattle, sheep, and goats can be hard on vegetation, especially in marginal environments. Heavy grazing removes plant cover, compacts soil, makes it harder for plants to regenerate. In a wet climate with resilient ecosystems, moderate grazing might not cause lasting damage. But in a climate that was already becoming drier and more fragile, overgrazing could have pushed the system over the edge, removing enough vegetation to trigger the feedback cascade. Some researchers have pointed to evidence of human-induced environmental degradation from other regions and time periods. The argument is that if humans could transform landscapes in other contexts, they could have done so in the Sahara as well. However, other researchers are skeptical. They point out that the orbital forcing and climate feedbacks are more than sufficient to explain the drying without invoking human impacts. They note that the Green Sahara had sustained large animal populations, both wild and domestic, for thousands of years without collapsing. Why would human herding suddenly tip the balance? There's also evidence suggesting that pastoral peoples may actually have delayed the desertification in some areas. By managing their herds, by preventing overgrazing through seasonal movements, by selectively burning areas to promote grass growth, pastoral peoples may have maintained productive grasslands longer than they would have persisted naturally. Some climate models that include human land management show that the Sahara might have dried out up to 500 years earlier without pastoral peoples working to sustain the landscape. The truth is probably complex and variable. In some times and places, human activities may have accelerated degradation. In others, they may have delayed it. And in most cases, the overwhelming driver was the changing orbital parameters and the climate feedbacks they triggered. Human societies were victims of these changes far more than they were causes. But whether rapid or gradual, whether primarily natural or partly human influenced, the result was the same. The Green Sahara died, and the people who had called it home were forced to leave. The exodus was not a single migration, but a series of movements spanning centuries. As different regions became unlivable at different times, populations shifted to wherever water remained. The Nile Valley, the remaining lakes and rivers on the margins of the Sahara, the Sahel to the south, the Mediterranean coast to the north. Archaeological evidence shows spikes in site occupation in regions around the Sahara, coinciding with the aridification. The Nile Valley in particular shows evidence of increasing population pressure and settlement density right around the time the Sahara was drying. This wasn't accidental. Exodus and legacy. the echoes that shaped civilizations. Picture the Nile Valley around 5,300 years ago. For millennia, the Nile has been a relatively narrow ribbon of green cutting through desert and semi-desert, supporting a modest population of farmers and fishers. The valley is productive but not overwhelmingly populated. Life is stable. The annual flood brings fertile silt, crops grow, people are fed. And then, over the course of a few centuries, everything changes. People begin arriving from the west and southwest, not as raiders or conquerors, but as refugees. Entire communities, families with their cattle, their tools, their traditions. They're fleeing a land that no longer supports them. The lakes have dried. The rivers have stopped flowing. The grass has turned to dust. The Sahara is dying, and they have no choice but to leave. The Nile Valley suddenly finds itself hosting a dramatically increased population. There's competition for the best farmland, for access to water, for resources. This pressure, this sudden concentration of people in a limited area, creates both conflict and opportunity. Some researchers believe that this influx of Saharan refugees into the Nile Valley was one of the factors that may have contributed to the unification of Egypt and the rise of pharaonic civilization. Before the unification, the Nile Valley was divided into numerous small polities. After the unification, around 3100 BCE, give or take a few decades, depending on which chronology you follow, Egypt became a centralized state ruled by god kings who commanded resources on an unprecedented scale. The timing is suggestive. The most intense period of Saharan aridification, between roughly 5,500 and 3,500 years ago, directly precedes and overlaps with the emergence of the unified Egyptian state. It's possible that the social stresses created by increased population, by the need to manage limited water resources more carefully, by competition and conflict among groups, created conditions that favored the emergence of centralized authority. If you can control the land along the Nile, if you can organize labor to dig and maintain irrigation canals, if you can store grain and redistribute it during bad years, then you have power. Enormous power. And those who could harness that power became kings. The connection is not just timing, there are cultural hints as well. Egyptian mythology includes references to the gods coming from the west, from the desert. Some scholars have suggested that these myths might preserve cultural memories of migrations from the drying Sahara. The Egyptian god Set, associated with chaos and the desert, may reflect the catastrophic nature of the Saharan desertification and its impact on populations. These interpretations remain speculative, but they're worth considering. It's also worth noting that the symbolic importance of cattle in early Egyptian culture, with bulls appearing as power symbols, and later with the goddess Hathor depicted as a cow, mirrors the central role of cattle in the pastoral cultures of the Green Sahara. Could this be a cultural legacy brought by pastoral peoples who migrated into Egypt? The connection is intriguing, though it remains difficult to prove conclusively. The exodus from the Sahara didn't just affect Egypt. Populations moved south into the Sahel and beyond, carrying with them their languages, their technologies, their cultural practices. Some linguistic evidence suggests that the spread of certain African language families may be linked to migrations out of the Sahara as it dried, though tracing these connections across thousands of years is challenging. The pastoral way of life didn't disappear. It simply moved to where it could still be sustained. the Sahel remains suitable for herding, with seasonal rain supporting grasslands, even as the Sahara to the north turned to desert. Pastoral cultures continue to this day in the Sahel, herding cattle, goats and camels in a lifestyle that, while adapted to modern realities, echoes practices developed thousands of years ago in the Green Sahara. Even the mythology of peoples far from the Sahara may contain echoes of its transformation, though these connections are highly speculative. The Greek myth of Phaethon, the son of the sun god Helios, who lost control of his father's chariot and scorched the earth, creating the deserts of Africa, has been interpreted by some as a cultural memory of the Sahara's drying. The image of a once green land turned to wasteland by the sun's heat certainly parallels what actually happened, though whether this represents genuine cultural memory transmitted across vast distances and millennia is impossible to prove. The Arabian Peninsula experienced a similar pattern. Like the Sahara, Arabia was much greener during the early to mid-Holocene due to enhanced monsoon rainfall, and like the Sahara, it dried out around the same time. Some researchers have proposed that migrations out of a greening Arabia provided pathways for early humans to leave Africa tens of thousands of years earlier, and that later migrations out of a drying Arabia may have influenced the peopling of Mesopotamia and the development of civilizations there. These ideas remain areas of active research. The connections are tantalizing but difficult to prove conclusively. The evidence is fragmentary. Written records don't exist for these time periods. We're left piecing together climate data, archaeological finds, genetic studies, and linguistic patterns to build hypotheses that can never be verified with absolute certainty. What is certain is that the drying of the Sahara had profound effects. It created a massive barrier across Africa, dividing north from south more completely than perhaps any other time in the past 100,000 years. Trade routes had to adapt. The famous trans-Saharan trade routes that would later carry gold, salt, and slaves didn't emerge until after the domestication of camels, animals capable of surviving the extreme conditions of the full desert. Those routes followed the narrow corridors of oases that remained, tiny islands of green in an ocean of sand. The genetic legacy is real too. Studies of modern populations show evidence of migrations consistent with movement out of the Sahara as it dried. North African and sub-Saharan African populations show signs of ancient admixture, mixing that occurred during the Green Sahara, when the Sahara was not a barrier but a habitable zone where different groups could interact. And physically, the dried lake beds of the Green Sahara continue to affect the world today. The Bodele Depression in Chad, part of the ancient Lake Megachad Basin, is now the single largest source of atmospheric dust on Earth. Every year, winds lift hundreds of millions of tons of dust from this dried lake bed and carry it across the Atlantic Ocean. Some of that dust falls on the Amazon rainforest, where it provides nutrients, particularly phosphorus, that are essential for maintaining the fertility of tropical soils. So in a strange way, the death of Lake Megachad feeds the Amazon. The dust of the Sahara fertilizes the lungs of the earth. These connections operate on scales and timescales that no single human observer could perceive, but they're real, part of the vast interconnected system that is Earth's climate. The Sahara today and what it teaches us. Stand in the Sahara today, in the deep desert far from any oasis. The heat is overwhelming. At midday, surface temperatures can exceed 70 degrees Celsius, hot enough to fry an egg on a rock, though there are no eggs and precious few rocks that aren't buried under sand. The air is dry enough that sweat evaporates almost instantly, cooling you through evaporation, but also dehydrating you at a terrifying rate. The horizon shimmers with heat distortion. If you're lucky, you might see a herd of camels in the distance, driven by Tuareg nomads who have adapted over generations to survive in this hostile environment. If you're unlucky, you see nothing but sand and sky, a minimalist landscape stripped of almost everything except endurance. It's hard, standing in that furnace, to imagine that 7,000 years ago, you might have been standing knee-deep in grass, watching elephants at a waterhole, listening to birds calling from the trees along a nearby river. The transformation is complete. The Green Sahara is buried under sand and silence. But the Sahara isn't static even now. It's still changing, and not in a good way. Modern observations show that the Sahara has been expanding over the past century. Analysis of rainfall data from weather stations across North Africa suggests that the desert has grown by approximately 10% since detailed records began around 1920. That's an area larger than the United Kingdom added to the desert in just 100 years. Research indicates that about 2/3 of this expansion is attributed to natural climate variability, the same kind of decadal and multi-decadal fluctuations that have always occurred. But roughly 1/3 appears to be linked to human-caused climate change, specifically the way global warming is affecting tropical circulation patterns and precipitation. Lake Chad, the modern remnant of Lake Megachad, has shrunk dramatically in recent decades. In the 1960s, it covered about 25,000 square kilometers. By the early 21st century, it had declined to less than 1,500 square kilometers at some point. While it's fluctuated since then, the long-term trend is clearly toward a smaller lake. Millions of people in Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon depend on Lake Chad for water, fish, and irrigation. As it shrinks, their livelihoods disappear. The causes are complex. Climate change plays a role, but so do dams and irrigation projects that divert water from the rivers feeding the lake. So does increased agricultural use of groundwater. The modern situation isn't a perfect analogue for the ancient drying, but there are echoes. Water disappearing, populations under stress, communities forced to abandon land they've occupied for generations. The Sahel region, the transition zone between the Sahara and the greener regions to the south, is particularly vulnerable. It's a marginal environment where small changes in rainfall can make the difference between viable agriculture and famine. Droughts in the Sahel in the 1970s and 80s killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions more. While rainfall has partially recovered since then, the region remains precarious, with populations growing even as the environment becomes more fragile. There's also the question of the future. Earth's orbital parameters continue their slow dance. The precession cycle that brought about the Green Sahara and then took it away is still operating. In theory, the Sahara will green again, eventually. The calculations suggest that the next greening could begin in roughly 15,000 years, assuming no other factors intervene. But that's a big assumption. We're now in uncharted territory. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are higher than they've been in millions of years, rising at a rate unprecedented in the geological record. We're warming the planet on a timescale of decades, not millennia. The question is whether this human-caused warming will override the orbital cycles, preventing the next Green Sahara from occurring, or whether it might even accelerate it. Some climate models suggest that global warming could actually increase rainfall in parts of the Sahara and Sahel. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. Stronger temperature gradients between land and sea could intensify the African monsoon. There's satellite evidence that parts of the Sahara are showing increased vegetation in recent years, possibly linked to increased rainfall from climate change. But this is complex and uncertain. Other models suggest that changing circulation patterns could actually decrease Sahel rainfall even as the global average temperature rises. The truth is we're running a vast, uncontrolled experiment on Earth's climate system, and we don't fully understand all the consequences. What the Green Sahara teaches us is humility. It shows us that climate can shift dramatically, that landscapes we think of as permanent are actually temporary, that human societies can be utterly transformed by environmental changes beyond their control. It also teaches us about feedbacks and tipping points, the same mechanisms that amplified the greening, that turned a modest increase in summer sunlight into a 6,000-year-long oasis, also amplified the drying when conditions reversed. Climate systems have leverage points where small changes can cascade into large effects. We're pushing on those leverage points right now, and we need to understand what we're doing. The speed of the transition in some regions of the Sahara is sobering. A few hundred years from lake to desert. That's nothing on geological timescales. On human timescales, it's everything. It's the destruction of a way of life, the forced abandonment of ancestral lands, the collapse of ecosystems that had supported abundant life. We're witnessing similar processes today, not just in the Sahel, but around the world. The American Southwest is in a multi-decade drought that some scientists call a mega drought, possibly the worst in 1,200 years. The Mediterranean is warming and drying faster than the global average. Glaciers that have existed for thousands of years are disappearing in a matter of decades. Permafrost is thawing. Sea levels are rising. These aren't distant future scenarios. They're happening now. The people who lived through the drying of the Sahara didn't have the benefit of scientific understanding. They didn't know about orbital mechanics or feedback loops. They just knew that the rains weren't coming the way they used to, that the lakes were shrinking, that they had to move or die. They adapted as best they could. They moved south. They concentrated along rivers. They developed new technologies and social structures to cope with the changing world. We have advantages they didn't. We understand what's causing the changes, at least broadly. We have technology. We have the ability, in theory, to reduce our emissions, to slow the rate of warming, to adapt our societies in ways that minimize suffering. But we also have disadvantages. Our population is orders of magnitude larger. Our societies are more complex and in many ways less resilient than those ancient pastoral communities. We're more dependent on systems that can fail catastrophically, and we're changing the climate much, much faster than the orbital cycles ever did. The Green Sahara is not a perfect analog for our current situation, but it's instructive. It reminds us that the Earth system is dynamic, that stability is temporary, that what seems permanent can vanish with shocking speed when feedbacks amplify change. And it reminds us that human societies persist through environmental changes by adapting, by moving, by changing their ways of life. Those Saharan pastoralists didn't prevent the desert, but they survived it, carrying their culture and their knowledge into new lands where they rebuilt their lives and ultimately contributed to the rise of some of the world's greatest civilizations. We stand now at our own transition point. The climate is changing. The world our grandchildren inherit will be different from the one we grew up in. The question is how different, and whether we'll manage that transition with wisdom and foresight, or whether we'll stumble into catastrophe the way those ancient Saharans watched helplessly as their world dried up around them. But there's reason for hope too, because humans are remarkably adaptable. We've survived and even thrived through dramatic environmental changes before. The people who painted those rock art images, who herded their cattle across grasslands that are now sand, who fished those enormous perch from lakes that are now dust, they endured. Their descendants are still here, still creating art, still herding cattle in the places where it remains possible, still telling stories, still remembering. The Sahara will green again someday. The orbital cycles guarantee it, assuming we don't disrupt them so fundamentally that the mechanisms break. In 15 or 20,000 years, the monsoons will return, the lakes will fill, grass will grow, elephants will return, if any still exist then. And perhaps people will live there again, wondering at the rock art left by ancient peoples, trying to understand how anyone could have survived in the barren landscape that came between the greenings. And maybe, if we're very lucky and very wise, some of those future people will find records we left behind, stories about our time, warnings and lessons learned too late, or perhaps, if we make the right choices now, messages of hope, evidence that we saw what was coming, understood what we were doing, and changed course before the feedback loops locked us into catastrophe. The Sahara has been green. The Sahara has been desert. The Sahara will be green again. The only question is what we do in the meantime, and what kind of world we pass on to the people who will tell our stories in the millennia to come. Closing. Voices across the sands. Before we end tonight, go back one more time to that rock face in Tassili Naja. You're standing in the cool of evening, the brutal day heat finally fading. The rock wall before you is covered in images, cattle with long curved horns, a woman with a child, a group of people dancing, their postures suggesting movement frozen in stone, an elephant, trunk raised, every detail of its form captured with care by an artist who's been dead for 7,000 years. You reach out and touch the image. The paint is dry, faded, but still visible, protected by the overhang above. Your fingers trace the outline of the elephant, and for just a moment, you can feel the connection. Someone stood here, someone who loved their family, who took pride in their work, who looked at the world with wonder and wanted to share what they saw. They painted this. They wanted it to last. They wanted to be remembered. They lived in a world utterly different from ours, yet fundamentally the same. They loved, they grieved, they laughed and feared and hoped. They watched the sky for rain. They told stories to their children. They grew old, if they were lucky, and passed on what they knew to the next generation. And they watched their world change in ways they couldn't control, driven by forces they couldn't understand. They adapted, they endured, and when they couldn't stay any longer, they left. But before they left, they They painted, they carved, they said we were here. This is what we saw. This mattered. Those images remain. The elephants and cattle and dancers on the rock walls, the handprints blown in pigment, the scenes of life as it was lived in the Green Sahara, their messages in bottles, thrown across an ocean of time, washing up on our shores 7,000 years later. And we can read them. We can see what they wanted us to see. The Green Sahara is gone, but it's not forgotten. It lives in the geological record, in the rock art, in the genetic legacy of populations that trace back to those ancient pastoralists, in the dust that feeds the Amazon, in the stories we tell when we try to understand how climate changes and what it means for our future. If this story has brought you some peace, if it's helped you rest, then the voices from those painted rocks have done their work. They've connected us across the vast gulf of time, reminding us that we're all part of something larger, something that flows through generations, adapting and enduring even as individual lives and entire worlds come and go. Sleep well. Dream of Green Sahara, of lakes that stretch to the horizon, of elephants and grass and rain, of people who live full lives in a place that no longer exists, except in memory, in stone, and in the eternal dance of orbital mechanics that will someday bring the rains back to the desert. And if you found comfort or insight in this journey through time, consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, rest easy. The Sahara was green. The Sahara will be green again. And in between, we tell the stories. Good night.